This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's July 1st, 2021. I'm Ross John Fortune. The federal government faces challenges each day, from climate change to the COVID-19 crisis to fighting domestic terrorism. More than 20 years ago, public administration scholar Paul C. Light published a study assessing government's biggest accomplishments of the second half of the 20th century. In GovExec, he wrote, quote, "It is difficult not to be proud of what the federal government has tried to achieve in the past half-century. Name a significant domestic or foreign problem, and the federal government made some effort to solve it. If a nation's greatness is measured in part by what its national government succeeds in doing, the United States measures up very well indeed." The sentiment in the 20 years since Light wrote that is not the same. The flourishing of political dissonance has brought many of the government's very public failures to the fore. A public sentiment emerged at the end of the 20th century that government should be shrunk, hamstrung, and nearly eliminated, framing the relationship between the public and private sectors as a zero-sum game. Government's public corruption scandals further eroded faith in the system, exacerbating the problem. But government's economies of scale are unmatched. As political scholar Dr. Paul Wallace once said, government is the cause of problems, sure, but it is often the best and only solution. The federal government has unparalleled reach and, more importantly, the financial considerations to commit billions to, for example, Operation Warp Speed, finding a set of COVID-19 vaccines within 18 months. On GovExec, our guest writes that the last few decades have seen many examples of government and its workforce excelling at problem solving and succeeding in improving the lives of Americans. Tom Shoop is editor-at-large and the former executive vice president and editor-in-chief at GovExec Media. After a short break, he'll join me to discuss his post and some government success stories. Want to hear more from GovExec, NextGov, Defense One, and Route 50? Tune in to our virtual events to hear interviews with government leaders about the most important topics today, including the federal workforce, health IT, artificial intelligence, 5G, and more. Visit govexec.com/events to learn more. The United States has found itself facing many challenges in the decades since the turn of the century. From terrorism to pandemics to climate change, the federal government's work is and has been cut out for it. Government successes, however, are often less public than its struggles. Our guest today writes that, quote, "It's not what government has accomplished that's significant, but what it has prevented from happening." Tom Shoop is editor-at-large and the former executive vice president and editor-in-chief at GovExec Media. He has a post on our site right now headlined 6 Big Government Success Stories of the Last 2 Decades. He joins me now to talk about the post and some government success stories. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be here again. It's been a while.
So why did you choose to write this, and what criteria did you use to deem something a government success story?
I wrote it because I got the idea in my head that I think it's fairly clear at this point that many, many people across the political spectrum think the federal government in particular couldn't organize a one-car funeral. With that in mind, I thought there are several things government has done. And I think if you go back more than 20 years, there's a long list of federal accomplishments, from the interstate highway system to improving the poverty situation, to the list goes on. And people accept that, but they don't accept quite as readily that government does things right in the past couple of decades. So I thought, let's make a list of some representative things. And as for criteria, what I was looking for were extraordinary accomplishments, not just not having any planes crash or the kind of things that are within government, the federal government's purview, and that it's supposed to do on a regular basis, but things that people may have overlooked or just simply forgotten about, that or didn't know about, that government has actually accomplished.
Why 6? Why not 10? Why not 5? Why not 3?
6 is the number that I ended up with when I had a list of about 10, and some of them didn't turn out to be success stories. And some of them I couldn't really make a judgment. So I landed on 6 as being representative examples. I'm sure there are others, and these are, I set the bar pretty high in terms of prominence. So there are lots of other minor or comparatively minor success stories, and stories of individual accomplishment, but these are sort of really big things.
So let's talk about some of them. We won't spoil the post too much. We obviously want people to read our site. But what are some of the highlights of these successes of the 21st century?
Sure. Just to run down some of them. The one that sort of got me started on this whole idea was the development of the COVID vaccine, which remarkably, I think people took for granted when it was an absolutely extraordinary accomplishment. And only the federal government could have mustered the kind of resources in the way that they did to push that forward. And I think the interesting thing is that across the political spectrum, whether you choose not to take a vaccine as a political act, essentially, or whether you got vaccinated the minute that you could get vaccinated, I think strong majorities of both of those people just sort of took for granted that the accomplishment involved in developing the vaccine. So that was kind of a jumping off point. Others that made my list were averting the financial catastrophe in 2008, and you referenced this in the introduction, that this is on the list of things where the government may not have accomplished something, achieved something positive, but stopped something extremely negative from happening. We were on the verge of an absolute catastrophic financial collapse, and through a series of creative government actions, averted that. So that was on the list. Expanded access to health insurance. Say what you will about the Affordable Care Act, 17 million more people got health insurance as a result of that legislation, which is an accomplishment. Improved children's health. I think this one is very much under the radar, that there has been steady improvement, especially in the past couple of decades, in children's health, and especially in the poorest counties in the country, which, again, taken for granted. Increased infrastructure investment. The jury is still out on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, what the impact will be, but 1.2 trillion with a T is a lot of money to be putting toward improving the nation's infrastructure. So that's a significant accomplishment just to get the ball rolling on that. And finally, I'll give away the whole list, improved highway safety. This has gone on for decades. In the 1930s, when the automobile first became a dominant mode of transportation, the number of fatalities per mile traveled was off the charts compared to what it is today. And that had steadily improved in the early early part of the 21st century, due to everything from seatbelt laws to stricter drunk driving laws, to requirements that vehicles be crash resistant. Interestingly, when the pandemic started, that started to tick back up in the other direction, because the theory is that people just weren't as careful and safe in their driving habits as they were pre-pandemic. So it sort of remains to be seen there where the long-term trend is, but I think it bends towards safety. And that's the list.
I mean, you mentioned it earlier about sort of the hidden work that the government does. What is some of that stuff that Operation Warp Speed is sort of a public thing that I guess the highway safety stuff is certainly less public, and certainly something I know a lot of our readers hadn't thought about. But what are some other examples of that didn't make the list, or just our sort of quotidian functions of government?
It's a long list. It's everything from food safety inspection to airline safety to the folks at TSA regularly doing passenger screening, and law enforcement. There's just a long list, and regular day by day, month by month, year by year accomplishments and new achievements in those areas. I mean, you look at the Service to America medals, and every year they're able to find people who have done just absolutely amazing things within the context of how government just operates on a regular basis.
So we, on this show, to a certain extent, don't do it very much, but look, government has not a great reputation. And in the longer intro before we brought you on, I talked about public sentiment emerging sort of at the end of last century as before Paul Light wrote his big study assessing government's accomplishments. There was this political sentiment that government is bad. It should be not just hamstrung, but shrunk as small as possible. I understand that corruption, and certainly Watergate, the legacy of Watergate and Whitewater and things like that since have really contributed. But with the context of that, why do people hate government so much?
I think there are two reasons. One sort of unfair and one fair. The unfair one is they tend to take for granted what government does, and have very high expectations for how it's going to serve them. And so I think anything short of perfection tends to frustrate people. The more fair criticism is, and this is something, I was a little depressed in putting together the list of government failures in the past couple of decades is at least as long as the success stories, and arguably more prominent. We're talking about things like climate change and racial justice and gun safety and the overall COVID-19 response, not just the vaccine. These are areas where you could make a strong case that government has not performed in the way that it needed to solve these problems. So I think people are rightly frustrated with government's inability to do certain things. And on top of that, people in government, there's a bit of a tendency to want government to consistently get credit for doing things that it's supposed to be doing, that it's funded to do. Like keeping food safe conducting scientific research, investigating crime at a federal level. You don't really get extra pats on the back for that. You've got people and a budget, and that's what you're supposed to do. Planes aren't supposed to fall out of the sky. You don't get extra credit for making sure that doesn't happen.
I'll try to temper this as best I can, and then I'll let you go, which is I sometimes have this argument with, I'll just say people in my life who have a much more politicized, I think, view of the current situation. And that is a through line, is that there is this, perhaps it's American optimism, perhaps it's a identity thing or whatever, but there's a lot of defending government, particularly when it's one's team, Democrats or Republicans, when it is not doing its job. And I think you hit on it. So a thing I've really been frustrated with is the COVID-19 response, not just from the previous administration, but this one as well. And the amount of sunniness that everything becomes comparative analysis about, well, they're doing worse here, they're doing worse there. And what often comes up is non-OECD countries or the previous administration, which pretty much actively hated government. It's like, that's not the comparison point. Like, that's where it becomes frustrating. It's this idea. It's like, the US has our vaccine rate or our transmission rate is above these 5 countries that you would consider to be in the global South. And it's like, if that's the comparison point, we got problems. Like, we should be, the idea is that the US is the superpower, and we have the government has economies of scale and nearly infinite riches. It should be better, and I'm always deeply frustrated with some of the inabilities of things to be solved, and there's a million different, I think, political and socio economic and other kind of factors there. But boy, given a gold star for fighting the federal employee vaccine mandate in the courts, like, that's not worth a gold star. That's what you're supposed to do, So
yeah,
I'm someone who believes in government probably more than most.
What I will say relative to gold stars is that I think federal agencies deserve some extra credit and some praise in the past decade in particular for operating under circumstances that, one, are just polarized to an almost unprecedented degree, and two, in the face of actions by elected officials and inaction by elected officials that make it just extremely difficult to get the regular job done. When you routinely don't have a budget until well after the fiscal year starts, and when there's a constant threat of government shutdowns, doing the normal things under those circumstances is a pretty significant achievement.
Hopefully people are listening this deep into the show, but I should clarify. I'm doing the thing that I hate when people do, which is equating government with elected officials. And you make that distinction well. I think it should be noted that because people entangle those things so much, the actual people doing the work, and I know those are the people that listen to this show, whether they're on the contracting side or on the political appointee side or on the career fed side, it is invaluable work under impossible circumstances. And I have such a I know I'm kissing the audience is behind here a little bit, but I have a lot of respect for that. And I think that's where this can be so frustrating, is as I'm recording this from your office here at the Watergate, and I see the Fifth Risk up on your bookshelf, and I'm reminded of that the Fifth Risk outlines how much those people work to do so many things that keep planes up in the air, or the Y2K bug from happening, although that was before the 21st century. But the vaccine distribution that, was actually quite a success if people weren't so frustrating about taking it.
Right. And involved things that I think the people who understand what they really did, that universe is tiny. Like, I don't know how they did it, but they did it in terms of working creatively under federal procurement rules to make sure that there was a supply of vaccines immediately if they made it through the review process. That I certainly don't have anywhere near full knowledge. All I know is that is an incredible accomplishment to use the system in that way. So there's much to be much praise to be given to the people who did that.
Sure, and I will be a sunnier side than I normally am and say that, yeah, I think that should be celebrated. I think certainly your post outlines the ways that those people worked so hard over so many years under such difficult circumstances to really bring that to the fore. Something we don't get enough on our site. We do cover a lot about recent failures like the TSP record keeper transition or healthcare.gov many years ago, but these are truly some impressive things. And Tom, thanks so much for being on the show with us.
Great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John, for today. We want to thank Tom Shoop for joining the program. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Check us out on the Clubhouse app by searching for GovExec Daily. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @GovExec. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.